nearly 58% of students, when they're asked what their primary reason for enrolling in a degree program, they say it's to achieve career outcomes or professional outcomes.
You're listening to Enrollment Growth University from Helix Education, the best professional development podcast for higher education leaders looking to grow enrollment at their college or university. Whether you're looking for fresh enrollment growth techniques and strategies, or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to Enrollment Growth University, a proud member of the Connect EDU podcast network. I'm Eric Olson with Helix Education, and we're here today with Amrit Ahluwalia, Editor-in-Chief of The Evolution. Amrit, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So excited to talk with you today about the results from your recent survey addressing the gaps between the modern adult learner and what higher education is actually offering them. Before we dig in, can you give our listeners a little bit of background on both The Evolution and your role there?
For sure. So The Evolution is an online newspaper focused on, call it non-traditional higher education and transformation. We were founded by Modern Campus in 2012. Basically focused on trying to share stories, exploring how higher education is changing and how colleges and universities are adapting to keep pace. So what we do is focus exclusively on working with institutional leaders at higher ed institutions in Canada and the US, basically to talk about that. And our focus since we started was really on demographic changes and shifting student expectations and what that means to the norms of our higher education industry.
I'm grateful for the research work that you're doing because a lot of very, very interesting ahas came out of this work. Amrit, to kick us off, can you give us just kind of that high-level overview on the goals and methodology behind this specific recent survey, the State of Continuing Education 2021, exposing the modern learner engagement gap?
Absolutely. Well, this is our second year running a State of CE survey. And basically, I guess the roots of the survey are in the lack of data living in the non-degree and continuing ed space. There's a huge amount of data on the traditional higher education side, but one of the things that we've noticed is as continuing education and non-degree learning in general becomes increasingly important, there's almost no data around what the standards of the industry are, what's happening in the space, what challenges higher ed leaders are facing when they're working in the continuing ed or non-degree space. So fundamentally, that's what we wanted to solve. So we ran our first State of CE survey last year and published it last February, I believe. And then this year's survey, again, it's basically a survey of our subscriber base. Anyone who's an Evolution subscriber with a .edu or a .ca email address has the capacity to answer our questions. And yeah, what we're basically trying to do is get to the bottom of what's happening in the non-degree or non-traditional higher ed space. We found, as you've alluded to, some pretty amazing stuff. The very fact of the matter is that more and more higher ed institutions are really prioritizing non-degree or continuing education, but very few institutions are really resourcing those divisions to make substantive change. We have higher ed leaders who recognize the importance of a digital experience to engaging the learners that they're serving, but also don't really believe in their own infrastructure to deliver the experience their students expect. So it's been interesting with this year's survey, kind of seeing, I guess, the ideal state for what higher ed could or should look like, and then facing the reality of where we are.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for the longitudinal nature of your survey that nothing crazy happened in the past year. So I'm guessing these are just, very same as old data. But Amrit, you actually teased out, I think, the couple of things that I was the most excited to dig in with you. So let's start digging into some of these learnings or what you do with this data. So I admit that I was a bit surprised that 68% of adults considering going back to school would prefer a non-degree alternative program. Talk about this broader trend toward non-degree programming and where you believe learners are at with this demand versus where higher ed is at with offerings to match it.
So to give appropriate credit to that statistic, that came from Strata Network, and that was part of their public viewpoint surveys from 2020, where basically what they were doing is surveying the American public on their higher ed demands. So what we found particularly fascinating about that 68% stat, and the reason why we wanted to integrate it or at least highlight it as part of the State of CE, is to give a sense of the fact that, the interest in non-degree and continuing education isn't something that's happening in a vacuum, in back rooms at colleges and universities. It's something that the market actually wants. And it makes a ton of sense. Nearly 58% of students, when they're asked what their primary reason for enrolling in a degree program, they say it's to achieve career outcomes or professional outcomes. I believe UCLA recently did a survey of their incoming freshman class, and something like 80% of students highlighted the value of their education to career outcomes. Oh. So a desire for career impact is nothing new for any higher education student. The problem is that they're recognizing that, the more traditional pathways to education that we've sort of forged out aren't leading there. A Burning Glass survey that was released towards the end of last year pointed out that nearly 2 in 5 bachelor's degree holders are underemployed in their first job. And when you consider the fact that the majority of students are enrolling because they want career outcomes, 40% of students being underemployed in their first role is borderline unacceptable. So, looking at that in conjunction with the expense of a traditional degree program and, the promise of most non-degree programs being very specifically around career outcomes, it makes a ton of sense that students are starting to recognize that maybe there's another way. So that 68% stat on its face can be a little surprising, but I'll tell you, as someone who has managed a publication focused on non-degree education for the past decade, it was really almost a breath of fresh air to see that, this thing that we've all been talking about in sort of generalities is in fact very much the case when the rubber hits the road. At the end of the day, it's our recession playbook as an industry is vastly outdated. We're not meeting students where they are, and it's the reason that there was a 3% enrollment dip in a period of massive unemployment, which generally leads to between a 1.9 and 2.5% enrollment increase for degree programs.
Yeah, Amrit, what did this survey tell us about internal concerns with our institution's abilities to add new programs to chase these trends at the pace of market demand?
It's really interesting. So one of the things that we found, obviously, when we asked about the biggest challenges to scaling or expanding non-degree ed, folks pointed to the things that you'd expect. So, they were concerned around the market demand. So they wanted to make sure that programming actually meets labor market expectations, skills expectations, the administrative burden of simply developing and launching new programs, the cost of launching new programs, the time to market for new programs, like all these things that we understand as being common roadblocks, especially to non-degree program launches, because for the most part, schools aren't really set up to do programming outside of a semester schedule. Schools aren't really set up to do programming that has to go to market extremely quickly and cannot, literally fall off the side of someone's desk in an approval process. So we certainly saw those. But one of the really fascinating things that came out was, that there were multiple choice options to that question. And then we also asked folks if there's anything else that they'd like to add in terms of obstacles to scaling or expanding non-degree. And looking at that and doing a keyword analysis on the responses, we kind of lumped it into 4 buckets. So, acceptance and support of non-degree programming from the main campus is lacking, right? The capacity for staff to actually do innovative work, they're challenged. There's a lack of budget and financial support. So, really, non-degree programs, continuing ed units are generally cost recovery. So being able to commit additional resources to innovative programming can be a challenge. And then at its core, technology at the base being completely insufficient when it comes to actually delivering on these high expectations. These are all things that kind of stem from a lack of practical support from senior leadership when it comes to the role and capacity for continuing ed divisions to help keep their respective institutions competitive.
Amrit, how about digital gaps? What are our most common digital gaps preventing easy enrollment, high-octane, high-value learning experience specifically for these CE learners?
Absolutely. Well, a continuing ed learner, and frankly, every learner today is an experienced, seasoned consumer. This is someone who shops on Amazon with incredible regularity. This is someone who consumes media through Netflix or Amazon Prime or, any of the other 500 streaming services that are available. This is someone who's given up on taxis because Uber allows you to do it so much quicker and easier, right? So these, regardless of if you're 48 and looking for upskilling or 16 and trying to find your first school, every learner today is basically a digital native. Every learner today is fundamentally a technological expert when it comes to how they want to engage with major service providers, right? Like, why is the university behind the banks or the cable companies when it comes to delivering a customer experience? So I'd say that's fundamentally our first and biggest gap, is students have this expectation for an experience that's going to be seamless, for an experience that's going to be straightforward, for a website that's going to, provide them some sense of what it is that they need based on past browsing history, based on, previous enrollments, based on any of the things that any other company takes into account when someone lands on their homepage. But we don't do that in higher ed. We very much have this expectation that, the student is fortunate to even be considered by it. and so we don't behave that way. And as a result, boot camps have done very, very well. Right. Yeah. And MOOCs, despite the fact that people look at them and say, oh, look at their completion rate, have we ever considered that we're applying a traditional higher ed standard to a fundamentally non-traditional education providing mechanism? Yeah. Maybe students don't want to take all 12 MOOCs. Maybe they wanted a specific piece of information and they managed to log in, find that information and go. Right. So maybe the question isn't, did they do the thing we wanted them to do? Maybe the question is, did they do the thing they wanted to do? And I think fundamentally, like, if you look at, well, what's the thing that higher ed institutions need to do to close the digital divide? I mean, that's basically what you're asking. I would say, first and foremost, why don't we think about students like people and then treat them that way?
Mark, there's so much good stuff in this survey. Any specifically additional aha moments for you, things that surprised you and your colleagues?
I would say that, relatedly, it was the thing about the websites. So, not to give too much away, obviously we want folks to download the research, but here's two stats that if you're going to take anything away from the survey, take these two stats away with you. All right. Stat 1, 73% of respondents say the institution's website should play a leading role in deeply engaging students and facilitating their registration, right? So the website itself should be high quality. It should be personalized. It should provide some clear sense of what the consumer is looking for and what the service provider, in this case, the institution, is able to do to address their expectations and needs. 73%. Only 10% of respondents rate their website as very effective at driving student engagement, enrollment, and retention.
Yeah.
Right. So 3/4 of folks look at their website and say, "Wow, what amazing things the website could do as an engagement engine." And only 1 in 10 say, "And our website does that."
Yeah.
It's a startling divide, because when push comes to shove, we recognize that every consumer is digital first. We recognize that the majority of folks find our institutions online. We recognize that people want to use the website as a way to facilitate their enrollment process. They want to pay online with a credit card. They want to, go to the website and have an immediate sense of whether it's actually going to help them get to their endpoint. They want to find the website on their phone, start building a shopping cart, and then go on the computer to finish the purchase, like you would on Amazon or on Wayfair or any of these other services. But we just don't let them do it. So I would say if we're looking at, well, what's the ideal student experience, right? It starts at the first impression, and that's the website. So I'd say that's the major takeaway for me. And I apologize, because I know that's more tactical than I think folks might be looking for. But that's also the problem. We cannot think of the website as being this tactical thing that only 10% of the staff at an institution need to worry about.
Yeah.
Right? The website should be first and foremost our way of communicating with every stakeholder coming to the institution. If you're an alumni and you want that individual to either enroll in continuing education or donate to the school, they should have a homepage. When they go to compasspointuniversity.edu, right? They should be able to see pathways specifically designed for them to get to the outcome the institution knows they should be moving toward, right? Just like, again, any other company with any other set of personas would have a clear sense of who the people are coming to their website and how they want that person to progress. right? And fundamentally, if that's not strategic, and if it's not strategically designed around the outcomes that you, the institution, are trying to put into place for your learners, then we, the institution, have failed. Because again, we expect the student to feel fortunate that they're being considered by us, as opposed to the alternative, which is that, fundamentally, we, the institution, are fortunate that a student is considering us.
Amrit, such great stuff. Finally, any next steps advice for institutions who are looking to shrink that gap that you've talked about today, that gap between post-traditional student trends and the institution's own offerings? Where should they start first?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, again, and this is a shameless tease to the research, but the last page does outline about 10 action items that we feel are incredibly relevant for folks, given some of the stats that we bring up and some of the findings that we unearth in the research. But I would say at its very core, senior institutional leaders need to shift their thinking in two ways, right? One is the continuing education division and its role. So this is not a unit that, sits on the periphery of the institution and does some interesting stuff and generates revenue. I mean, they do that. But we need to recognize the role of continuing education as more of a strategic imperative for the institution itself, and we need to resource them appropriately, right? Again, now, one of the things that we found was that 76% of respondents said that they had senior leadership buy-in to scale and expand non-degree courses and programs. 76% of respondents say they have senior leadership buy-in to scale and expand non-degree programs and courses. But if you'll recall, the obstacles that I highlighted earlier kind of all root back to a lack of genuine senior leadership support when it comes to buy-in, when it comes to resourcing, and when it comes to maybe a little bit of true support around the engagement between continuing education and the main campus. The fact that cannibalization is still a concern for folks when it comes to expanding online education programming is a major, major concern. We should all be worried about that. So I would say first and foremost, senior institutional leaders need to recognize their role in strategically supporting and resourcing continuing education to do the great work that we expect continuing education units to do. Yeah, you know what? That's the major takeaway. I think that's the most important thing. And again, I'd highly recommend downloading the report. There's a lot of great information in there. We do lay out a number of other recommendations and opportunities, especially around, types of credentialing that seems to be on the horizon. And teaser, it looks like stackable credentials and micro-credentials are major areas of opportunity that folks are identifying. But you cannot achieve that outcome unless continuing education is supported and resourced appropriately.
And we'll, of course, put a link to that survey in the show notes. Amrit, thank you again so much for joining us. What's the best place for listeners to connect with you if they have any follow-up questions?
For sure. I'm on LinkedIn. You'll see how my name is spelled in the show notes, and you can certainly connect with me there. You can email us at info@evolutionwith3ls.com. That's, info@evolutionwith3ls.com. Those L's, by the way, stand for lifelong learning, just a fun fact for folks. And then if you do want to download the research, again, I know that the show notes will have this link, but just in case, you can visit moderncampus.com/CE21. That's again, moderncampus.com/CE21.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today, Amrit.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Attracting today's new post-traditional learners means adopting new enrollment strategies. Helix Education's data-driven, enterprise-wide approach to enrollment growth is uniquely helping colleges and universities thrive in this new education landscape. And Helix has just published the second edition of their enrollment growth playbook with 50% brand new content on how institutions can solve today's most pressing enrollment growth challenges. Download it today for free at helixeducation.com/playbook.
You've been listening to Enrollment Growth University from Helix Education. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.